You think pirates spent their days hunting for buried treasure and fighting epic sword battles, but here's what really kept them up at night: figuring out how to keep their food from turning into a science experiment. Let me tell you something that might shock you about life on the high seas. A pirate could survive a cannonball fight, navigate through the worst storms imaginable, and even handle a mutinous crew, but put him face to face with a barrel of rotting meat, and suddenly that fearsome sea dog becomes very interested in finding the nearest port. The average pirate ship carried enough supplies to feed a crew of 60 men for about 3 months. Do the math on that. We're talking about nearly 20,000 pounds of food floating around in wooden barrels below deck. But here's the kicker. Without proper preservation, most of that food would be completely inedible within 2 weeks. 2 weeks! Imagine planning a 3-month road trip, but knowing your snacks will go bad before you even leave your home state. Pirates weren't just battling the Spanish Navy or hunting merchant vessels. They were locked in a constant war against time itself, racing to consume their provisions before Mother Nature turned their food stores into something that would make a vulture lose its appetite. The smell alone could knock a grown man overboard, and trust me, these were guys who hadn't seen a bath in months. Here's where things get really interesting, and honestly pretty gross. Some desperate crews actually tried eating food that had gone bad, thinking a little mold never hurt anybody. Bad idea. Really, really bad idea. One ship's cook in 1724 wrote in his journal that the salt pork had turned so green it looked like seaweed. But the captain insisted they eat it anyway because fresh supplies were weeks away. Half the crew ended up sick as dogs, and the other half mutinied. Turns out there's nothing like food poisoning to destroy crew morale faster than you can say, "Yo ho ho." The most successful pirate captains weren't necessarily the ones with the biggest cannons or the fastest ships. They were the ones who figured out how to keep their crews fed with edible food for months at a time. These maritime masterminds developed preservation techniques that would make modern food scientists jealous. And they did it all without refrigeration, vacuum sealing, or even a basic understanding of bacteria. Now, you might think someone would have invented better storage methods, but remember, this was centuries before plastic containers or chemical preservatives. The best they could do was rely on techniques that had been passed down through generations of sailors, combined with whatever creative solutions desperate hunger could inspire. Some of these methods were brilliant. Others were absolutely disgusting. Most were a combination of both. The foundation of pirate food preservation was something every modern kitchen takes for granted. But back then, it was more valuable than Spanish gold. We're talking about salt, not the little packets you grab at fast food restaurants. We're talking about massive quantities of coarse sea salt that could preserve meat for months if you knew what you were doing. Pirates needed salt like a fish needs water, which is ironic considering they were surrounded by salt water that they couldn't drink. A single barrel of properly salted beef required about 50 pounds of salt to preserve correctly. That's 50 pounds for one barrel, and a decent-sized pirate ship might carry 30 or 40 barrels of meat. You can see how salt became one of the most important commodities on any pirate vessel. The process was surprisingly sophisticated for a bunch of guys who made their living breaking the law. First, they had to get the salt mix exactly right. Too little salt, and the meat would rot from the inside out. Too much salt, and the meat would become so hard, you'd need an axe to cut it, assuming you could even chew it without breaking your teeth. Pirates became experts at eyeballing the perfect ratio, developing an almost supernatural sense for how much salt each cut of meat required. But here's what made pirate salting different from what you might do in your backyard. These guys had to account for months of storage in the worst possible conditions. We're talking about meat sitting in wooden barrels in the hot, humid hold of a ship that's constantly rocking back and forth. The salt had to penetrate every fiber of the meat, creating a protective barrier that could withstand tropical heat, moisture, and time. The salting process itself was like watching a bizarre culinary ritual. Pirates would lay out fresh meat on the deck, covering every surface with thick layers of salt. The salt would immediately start pulling moisture out of the meat, which is exactly what they wanted. Within hours, you'd see puddles of bloody water forming around each piece. This wasn't just preserving the meat, it was completely transforming it into something that could survive the journey ahead. Different types of meat required different approaches, and pirates became surprisingly knowledgeable about the science behind preservation, even if they couldn't explain why it worked. Beef needed the heaviest salt treatment because it was dense and took longer for the salt to penetrate. Pork was easier to preserve, but had to be handled more carefully because pig fat could go rancid quickly. Fish required the lightest touch. Too much salt would turn it into something resembling leather. The really clever pirates figured out that the weather played a huge role in successful salting. Humid days meant the salt wouldn't draw out moisture as effectively, while dry, windy conditions could actually over-preserve the meat. Some captains became amateur meteorologists, timing their food preservation around weather patterns like their lives depended on it. Which, let's be honest, they absolutely did. Storage was another challenge entirely. Once the meat was properly salted, it had to go into barrels that were clean, dry, and sealed tight enough to keep out rats, insects, and seawater. Pirates developed their own barrel-making techniques, charring the inside of wooden barrels to create a protective layer and mixing their own sealants from tar, wax, and whatever else they could find. The weight of these preserved food barrels was staggering. A single barrel of salted beef could weigh over 400 pounds when full. Moving these monsters around during storms or battles required serious teamwork, and more than one pirate probably got his foot crushed trying to wrestle a barrel into position during rough seas. But salt preservation came with its own set of problems that would make any modern cook cringe. The meat would become so salty that eating it straight would be like licking the deck after a storm. Pirates had to soak their salted meat in precious fresh water for hours, sometimes days, before it was edible. This created a whole new challenge. They were using their limited freshwater supplies just to make their food edible. Some creative crews tried soaking their salted meat in seawater, figuring that salt water would gradually draw out the excess salt. This actually worked to some degree, though it meant their dinner tasted like the ocean floor. One ship's cook noted that after soaking salt pork in seawater for 2 days, it was edible, but tasted like someone had mixed their dinner with fish bait. The most experienced pirates could tell, just by looking at a piece of salted meat, whether it had been preserved correctly. Properly salted meat would be firm but not rock hard, with a deep reddish-brown colour that meant the salt had done its job. Meat that looked grey or had soft spots was destined for the fish, no matter how hungry the crew might be. When salt supplies started running low, which happened more often than you'd think, pirates had to get creative with preservation methods that didn't require their precious salt reserves. That's when they turned to techniques that would make modern food safety inspectors have nightmares, but somehow managed to keep crews alive during the longest voyages. The sun became their most reliable business partner when salt was scarce. Pirates discovered that the relentless Caribbean heat could transform fresh meat into something that would last for weeks, though the process required more patience than your average sword-wielding sea criminal typically possessed. Sun-drying wasn't just about laying meat out on the deck and hoping for the best. It was a delicate dance between timing, weather, and keeping the local wildlife from turning your food preservation efforts into an all-you-can-eat buffet. First, they had to slice their meat into strips thin enough that the sun could work its magic all the way through. Too thick, and you'd end up with jerky that was crispy on the outside, but rotting on the inside. Too thin, and a strong breeze might blow your dinner right into the ocean. Pirates became surprisingly skilled at judging the perfect thickness, usually about as wide as your thumb and twice as long. The real trick was timing everything just right with the weather. A sudden rainstorm could ruin days of drying progress, turning what should have been preserved meat into a moldy mess that even the ship's rats would avoid. Smart crews learned to read cloud formations like they were treasure maps, always ready to scramble and cover their drying racks when storm clouds appeared on the horizon. But the biggest challenge wasn't the weather, it was the flying thieves. Seagulls treated these meat-drying sessions like floating restaurants had just opened for business. Pirates had to post guards, not just to watch for enemy ships, but to keep these feathered pirates from stealing their carefully prepared provisions. Some crews got so frustrated with bird raids that they started timing their drying sessions for when they were far from shore, where fewer birds would bother them. One creative captain figured out how to use the ship's rigging to his advantage, stringing up meat strips high in the ropes where they'd catch both sun and wind. This method dried the food faster and kept it away from deck-bound pests, though it did make their ship look like it was flying some very unusual flags. Imagine trying to intimidate a merchant vessel when your intimidating pirate ship is decorated with strips of drying beef fluttering in the breeze. The success rate of sun-drying varied wildly depending on conditions. Perfect weather could turn fresh meat into preserved food in just 3 or 4 days. But throw in some humidity, unexpected clouds, or a few days without enough wind, and that same meat might take 2 weeks to dry properly, if it dried at all. Pirates learned to hedge their bets by drying smaller batches more frequently, rather than risking their entire food supply on one big drying session. Temperature control was crucial, and pirates became surprisingly good at improvising solutions. Some crews discovered that hanging dark cloth behind their drying racks helped concentrate the heat, while others found that certain parts of the ship stayed warmer throughout the day. The area near the galley was popular because the cooking fires added extra heat, though this also meant dealing with smoke and the occasional kitchen accident. When the weather refused to cooperate, pirates turned to another ancient preservation method that didn't depend on sunny skies. Smoking food was something humans had been doing for thousands of years, but doing it safely on a wooden ship surrounded by gunpowder required some serious creativity and more than a little courage. The smoking process usually happened during stops for water and supplies, when crews could safely build fires on shore without risking their ship. Pirates would construct makeshift smoking racks using whatever materials they could scavenge, usually green wood for the frame because it wouldn't catch fire easily, and dry hardwood for creating the actual smoke. Different woods gave the meat different flavors, and pirates became surprisingly picky about their smoking materials. Nobody wanted to use pine or other resinous woods because they made the meat taste like someone had mixed dinner with ship's tar. Instead, they preferred hardwoods like oak or fruit woods when they could find them. Some crews even started storing special smoking wood alongside their other supplies, taking up precious cargo space that could have been used for treasure. The smoking process itself required patience that most pirates weren't naturally blessed with. First, the meat had to be prepared by cutting it into strips and giving it a light coating of whatever salt they could spare. Then came the waiting game, hanging these strips over a very low fire for anywhere from 24 to 48 hours, making sure the smoke could circulate around each piece without the fire getting hot enough to cook the meat. Getting the temperature right was the trickiest part. Too hot, and you'd end up with cooked meat that would spoil quickly instead of preserved meat that would last for months. Too cool, and the smoke wouldn't penetrate properly, leaving you with raw meat that just smelled like a campfire. Pirates developed their own tests for perfect smoking conditions, usually involving holding their hand at various heights above the fire to judge the heat. Fire safety was obviously a major concern when you're working around a wooden ship filled with gunpowder, rum, and other flammable materials. Most crews had strict rules about smoking food on board. Some captains banned it entirely, while others allowed it only during calm weather, with multiple crew members standing by with water buckets. One ship's log from 1729 mentions a rule that anyone caught smoking meat without permission would be marooned on the next island they found, which seems harsh until you consider they were trying to prevent their entire ship from becoming a floating bonfire. The amount of food that could be smoked at once was impressive when conditions were right. A well-organized smoking operation could handle several hundred pounds of meat in a single session. Some crews developed shift systems, keeping their smoking fires going day and night when they had a safe opportunity. The constant smoke also had an unexpected benefit. It kept mosquitoes and other biting insects away from their coastal camps, making the whole experience slightly more bearable. But smoking had its limitations. The process required time, safe conditions, and materials that weren't always available. When pirates found themselves in situations where they couldn't make it to shore, or the weather was too dangerous for fire, they had to turn to preservation methods that could work entirely on board their ships, using supplies they already had in their holds. That's when pirates discovered something that would revolutionize food preservation aboard their ships, though it probably wasn't what you'd expect. These sea-hardened criminals became masters of fermentation, turning their ships into floating laboratories where controlled rot actually prevented the bad kind of rot. Sounds backwards, right? But this technique kept more pirates alive than all their cannons combined. The process started with something every pirate ship had in abundance: leftover scraps of vegetables, fruits, and whatever plant matter they could get their hands on during port visits. Instead of throwing these scraps overboard like most people would, clever pirates learned to pack them into barrels with just the right amount of salt water and let nature work its magic. Within a few weeks, what started as garbage became a sour, tangy mess that could last for months without spoiling. This wasn't your grandmother's sauerkraut recipe, though it worked on similar principles. Pirates would layer cabbage leaves, onion scraps, carrot pieces, and whatever other vegetables they could find, sprinkling each layer with coarse salt. The salt would pull moisture out of the vegetables, creating a brine that became the perfect environment for beneficial bacteria to take over before the harmful stuff could get established. It was like having a microscopic army fighting for their dinner. Though pirates had no idea about bacteria, they just knew it worked. The smell during the fermentation process was something that would make your eyes water. One ship's cook described it as a mixture of old cheese, vinegar, and something that died under the deckboards. But after a few weeks, that awful smell would transform into something sour and sharp that actually made their boring diet more interesting. Pirates called this concoction sea pickle, and it became as essential to long voyages as their rum rations. Different crews developed their own secret recipes, adding whatever spices or ingredients they could get their hands on. Some threw in bits of dried fish for extra flavor and protein. Others experimented with different types of salt, or tried fermenting fruits alongside vegetables. One particularly creative crew started adding small amounts of rum to their fermentation barrels, creating what they claimed was the world's first alcoholic sauerkraut, though this might have had more to do with keeping the crew happy than actual food preservation. The fermentation process required almost no maintenance once it got started, which made it perfect for busy pirates who had other things to worry about. Unlike salting or smoking, which required constant attention and perfect conditions, fermented foods basically took care of themselves. Pirates just had to resist the temptation to open the barrels too early, which was harder than it sounds when you're stuck eating hardtack for weeks on end. Storage was simple too. Fermented foods could sit in their own juices for months without any special treatment. The acidic environment they created was hostile to harmful bacteria, meaning the food would actually get safer to eat as time went on. Some barrels of fermented vegetables were discovered years later, still perfectly edible, though probably not winning any taste contests. But fermentation wasn't just about vegetables. Pirates also learned to ferment fish and meat when conditions were right, creating preserved proteins that could supplement their diet during the longest voyages. Fish fermentation was particularly popular in northern waters, where crews had access to different types of seafood. The process was similar to vegetable fermentation, but required more careful attention to prevent things from going wrong in spectacular ways. One of the most interesting aspects of pirate fermentation was how it accidentally solved a major health problem. Crews that regularly ate fermented food stayed healthier during long voyages, though they had no idea why. What they didn't know was that fermented foods helped maintain their gut health and provided essential nutrients that prevented various diseases. Modern science has proven that these accidentally brilliant pirates were practicing advanced nutrition without realizing it. The social aspects of fermentation created their own dynamics aboard ship. The The crew member who was best at managing the fermentation barrels became almost as important as the ship's cook. They were the ones who knew when to add more salt, when the fermentation was ready, and how to troubleshoot problems when things went wrong. Some ships even had formal positions for fermentation specialists, complete with extra rations and protected status during conflicts. When fermentation wasn't an option, either because they lacked the right ingredients or conditions weren't suitable, pirates turned to yet another preservation method that required nothing more than what nature provided, and a willingness to eat things that would make most people lose their appetite just thinking about it. Fat rendering became a crucial skill that separated successful pirate crews from those that starved during extended voyages. Every scrap of animal fat was precious, whether it came from the livestock they occasionally captured, the fish they caught, or even the seabirds they managed to snare during desperate times. This rendered fat wasn't just cooking oil. It was a preservation medium that could keep meat fresh for months when used correctly. The rendering process was hot, smelly work that nobody volunteered for, but everyone benefited from. Pirates would heat animal fat in large pots until it melted completely, then strain out any bits of meat or skin that might cause it to spoil. What remained was pure, clear fat that would solidify when cool and could be used to completely seal off pieces of cooked meat from air and moisture. The technique was called potting, and it required timing and skill that most pirates had to learn through trial and error. Cooked meat would be packed tightly into containers, then covered completely with hot, rendered fat. As the fat cooled and solidified, it created an airtight seal that prevented spoilage. Done correctly, potted meat could last 6 months or longer, even in tropical conditions. Different types of fat worked better for different purposes. Pork fat was the gold standard because it rendered cleanly and had a neutral flavour that didn't overpower the meat. Beef fat worked well too, but had a stronger taste that some crew members complained about. Fish fat was occasionally used when nothing else was available, though it gave everything a distinctly oceanic flavour that took some getting used to. The containers used for potting were almost as important as the fat itself. Pirates repurposed everything from small wooden kegs to ceramic pots they'd stolen from merchant ships. Some crews even used large seashells they'd collected, though these were more fragile and prone to breaking during rough seas. The key was finding containers that could be sealed completely and wouldn't crack under the weight of solidified fat. Potting required careful planning, because once you committed meat to a pot, you couldn't easily get it back out without breaking the seal and potentially ruining the entire batch. Pirates had to estimate how much meat they'd need for specific time periods and portion it accordingly. One pot might contain a week's worth of meat for the entire crew, while smaller pots held individual portions for special occasions or emergency rations. The most skilled practitioners of potting became known for their ability to layer different types of meat in a single container, creating variety that could make meals more interesting during long stretches at sea. They might put beef at the bottom, pork in the middle, and fish near the top, allowing the cook to serve different proteins without opening multiple containers. Quality control was crucial because one bad piece of meat could contaminate an entire pot, turning weeks of food into something that would kill rather than nourish. Pirates developed their own inspection methods, checking meat carefully for any signs of spoilage before committing it to the potting process. They also learned to work quickly once the rendering began, since hot fat could burn if left unattended, and ruined fat meant ruined preservation efforts. The social dynamics around fat rendering created interesting hierarchies aboard ship. Access to rendered fat became a form of currency, with successful hunters and fishermen earning extra portions for contributing to the communal fat supplies. Some pirates became specialists in the craft, trading their potting skills for better sleeping quarters or larger shares of captured treasure. When even these sophisticated preservation methods weren't enough, when storms destroyed their supplies, raids went badly, or voyages stretched longer than anyone anticipated, pirates had to turn to their most desperate measures. These final preservation techniques pushed the boundaries of what most people would consider food, but they kept crews alive when every other option had been exhausted. These final preservation techniques pushed the boundaries of what most people would consider food, but they kept crews alive when every other option had been exhausted. When you're staring down months at sea with empty food barrels and a crew that's starting to eye each other hungrily, you get creative fast. Pirates developed what they politely called emergency provisioning, though it was really just organized desperation with a fancy name. The first rule of emergency food preservation was that nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, got thrown overboard if it had even the slightest chance of being edible later. Pirates became masters at finding nutrition in places that would make modern survivalists look squeamish. Fish bones were ground into powder and mixed with whatever flour they had left. Fruit peels were dried and stored as emergency rations. Even the liquid from their fermented vegetables became a precious commodity that could add flavor to otherwise inedible meals. One of the most ingenious emergency techniques involved creating what pirates called survival paste. This wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't tasty, but it could keep a man alive when everything else failed. The recipe was simple in theory, but required serious desperation to execute. Pirates would take any remaining scraps of preserved meat, mix them with fish oil, add whatever edible plant matter they could find, and pound the whole mess into a dense, sticky paste that could be formed into small cakes. These survival cakes were absolutely horrific to eat, but they packed an incredible amount of nutrition into a small package. One cake about the size of your fist could provide enough calories to keep a grown man functioning for an entire day. The fat content was so high that they wouldn't spoil easily, and the dense texture meant they could withstand rough handling during storms or battles. The psychological aspect of these emergency preservation methods was almost as important as the nutritional benefits. When crew members saw their officers working to preserve every scrap of food, it boosted morale and prevented the kind of panic that could lead to mutiny. Pirates understood that hope was as important as calories when it came to survival, and the act of preserving food, even disgusting food, gave everyone something positive to focus on during desperate times. Some crews developed elaborate systems for rationing their emergency provisions, treating them like military supplies that required careful inventory and distribution. The quartermaster would keep detailed records of exactly how much emergency food they had, who was consuming what, and how long their supplies might last under different scenarios. This information became crucial for making decisions about whether to risk attacking a well-defended merchant ship, or whether to make dangerous detours to reach known supply ports. The most desperate preservation technique of all involved something that would make even hardened pirates think twice. When food supplies reached critically low levels, crews would begin preserving parts of their diet that normally wouldn't be considered food at all. Ship's rats, when they could catch them, were skinned, salted, and dried like any other meat. Seabirds that landed on their rigging during calm weather became impromptu additions to their food stores. One ship's log from 1731 describes a crew so desperate that they began collecting and preserving seaweed that washed up against their hull during storms. They'd dry it in the sun like indit into a powder that could jerky, then goody be mixed with water to create a thin soup. The taste was apparently so awful that grown men would cry while eating it, but it provided just enough nutrition to keep them alive until they could find better supplies. The preservation of insects became another emergency technique that separated the truly desperate from the merely hungry. Crews would collect beetles, grubs, and other creepy crawlies they found in their food stores, then dry them thoroughly before grinding them into protein powder. This insect flour could be mixed with water to create a paste or added to other foods to boost their nutritional value. One creative ship's cook discovered that roasted and ground beetles actually improved the flavor of their emergency survival cakes, though this might have been because anything was better than eating those cakes plain. Weather played a crucial role in emergency preservation efforts. Pirates learned to take advantage of every environmental condition to maximize their food preservation options. During particularly hot days, they'd set up elaborate drying operations using every inch of deck space. Cold snaps were used for natural refrigeration, allowing them to keep fresh catches edible for longer periods. Even rain became an opportunity, as they'd use the fresh water to rehydrate some of their more heavily preserved foods, making them slightly more palatable. The most successful emergency preservation efforts required the entire crew working together like a well-oiled machine. Everyone had specific roles, from the crew members who collected materials to the specialists who handled the actual preservation processes. Some pirates became known for their ability to find edible materials in the most unlikely places, while others developed reputations for being able to preserve anything that could remotely be considered food. Storage of emergency provisions required even more creativity than their preparation. Pirates had to find ways to keep these last resort foods safe from rats, moisture, and curious crew members who might be tempted to sample the emergency supplies before they were truly needed. Some captains kept emergency food stores under lock and key, treating them like they would their most valuable treasure. Others distributed small portions to individual crew members, making each person responsible for maintaining their own emergency rations. The psychological impact of having emergency food supplies cannot be overstated. Even knowing that they had awful-tasting survival cakes hidden away somewhere gave crews the confidence to take longer voyages and bigger risks. It was like having an insurance policy against starvation, even if collecting on that policy meant eating things that would make a vulture lose its appetite. Quality control for emergency provisions was almost impossible, since by definition these foods were being made from materials that wouldn't normally be considered edible. Pirates developed their own standards based on desperation levels. Food that wouldn't be acceptable during normal times became perfectly reasonable when the alternative was starvation. The rule seemed to be that if it wouldn't immediately kill you and provided some nutritional value, it qualified as emergency food. These extreme preservation methods created their own folklore among pirate crews. Stories would spread from ship to ship about crews that survived impossible situations by eating preserved rat jerky or seaweed paste. These tales served both as entertainment and as valuable survival information, teaching other pirates what might be possible when conventional food sources failed completely. So the next time you're complaining about your leftovers going bad in the fridge, just remember those resourceful sea criminals who turned food preservation into an art form using nothing but salt, sun, smoke, and sheer desperation. These pirates didn't just survive months at sea. They thrived by mastering techniques that would make modern food scientists tip their hats in respect. Who knew that staying alive on the high seas required more chemistry knowledge than sword fighting skills? If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. In the meantime, have a look at these videos.